gotta tell you, I gotta let you know, straight up, this is Zulu's testimony of faith and a message to my haters. Straight up. Let's go. No holding back.
All right, I want to thank you for joining me today for my lecture entitled Negroes for Sale, the Business of American Criminal Justice. Now, I'm a trial lawyer by trade, and I became a lawyer because I was inspired by my grandfather's admiration for great civil rights lawyers, specifically Avon Williams, who was a great civil rights lawyer in Nashville, Tennessee, as well as other great civil rights lawyers like Charles Hamilton Houston. We see Avon Williams, Z. Alexander Luby, Thurgood Marshall, and Johnny Cochran. These are what I call the greatest of all times. These are actually the greats. But as I became a lawyer and started practicing, what I realized was that the criminal justice system is not really the right name for the system. In fact, the word justice is actually inappropriate. In fact, it's a business, which actually currently inspired me to pursue my doctorate in business, because I think that's better suited as what goes on actually in the criminal justice system. So the title that I chose, Negroes for Sale, the Business of Criminal Justice, was chosen because I believe in the final analysis, that's really what our system of justice is all about. The origin of American criminal justice began with the plantation system, specifically with the plantation system of the use of African chattel to be used and reduced to animals to work on these plantations. And when I think of the plantation system, there's 5 elements. 1 is the exploitation of human capital. 2 is production, plantation system, slaves, services, and goods. 3, human capital, rules and regulations, the control of behavior, which is slave laws at the time, and the enforcement of rules and regulations, which were slave patrols and overseers. And as we go through this lecture, what you'll see is that these 5 elements that basically was at the foundation of the plantation system has continued to be the 5 elements that has, as the criminal justice system has progressed, has maintained. But when we talk about the exploitation of human capital, it has always been the exploitation of African Americans, right? So now, when we think of the 13th Amendment, actually after the Civil War, we realized there was the Emancipation Proclamation and ultimately the signing of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And that basically the 13th Amendment stated that the amendment states that neither involuntary servitude nor slavery should exist within the United States. But however, there were only allowed to be a form of punishment for those who committed a crime and were duly convicted. What's interesting after the Emancipation Proclamation was that slave owners were actually compensated by the government for those slaves that they had to release. They were given money. They were the only ones that were given actually reparations. So in essence, what the 13th Amendment actually did was actually made the government the new plantation. So instead of there being private plantations, the government, after the Emancipation Proclamation or the signing of the 13th Amendment, actually made the government the new plantation owner. Now, after the 13th Amendment and after slaves, after Reconstruction, what was implemented was what it was called slave laws. Slave laws were primarily vagrancy laws and similar laws that were enacted in almost every jurisdiction that only applied to black people. These were called black codes. At the same time, there was this other system that was called the convict lease system. So what would happen is if a black person was found being a vagrant, which means It could be anything, just standing on the street or standing on the sidewalk, just being out in public could be enough in many cases to convict somebody of a black code. Then once they're convicted, they could be leased out to the plantation, right? In fact, states like Louisiana, at one point in time, that made up almost 80% of their prison population were people who had been convicted of black codes and leased out to plantations. And the convict lease system made up almost 80% of the state's revenue. So it was still the money. It's the still same elements. The exploitation of human capital. Former slaves and the descendants were used for prison labor. The production, leased to plantation and businesses and sharecroppers. Number 3, human capital rules and regulations. These particular rules and regulations that were only applied to African Americans, vagrancy laws, the black codes, and the enforcement of rules and regulations, which were the patrols, overseers, which was the police, prisons, courts, and prosecutors. I say that when we talk about the enforcement of rules and regulations, right, we go back to the very beginning, which was the law enforcement from the very beginning of the first law enforcement were the slave patrols in this country. And as it evolved in one way or another, it continued to mirror the time. For example, during the black codes, that's when you saw where you think about the plantation and you think about the overseers. Then oftentimes when you think about the criminal justice system, when you're thinking about the police, the prisons, the courts, and the prosecutors, in many ways, they stand in that same capacity as they did during the plantation. Because on the plantation, you had overseers, right? So it was almost the same thing. And then we see, and when we talk about black codes in the convict lease system, it started at a very young age. They were beginning to take black young men into our boys into custody as when they're 10, 11, 9 years old, and putting them on plantations just as they did during the slave days. Now we move to what I call the Jim Crow Senior and the COINTELPRO aspect. Now what we've gone through the black code period. And during that particular time and up to the time of Jim Crow, there was this argument. There's a famous case called Plessy versus Ferguson, which says separate but equal, meaning that basically it was legal to separate people and to segregate people as long as the accommodations were similar or the same, right, or equal. And in almost all cases, that was really not the case. And that continued with this whole idea of the black codes. There was a lot of similarities between Jim Crow's and the black codes. In fact, Jim Crow laws, you could actually be punished for violating laws relative to the time related to what they consider to be Jim Crow. And for those, when we talk about segregation, just to be clear, I'm talking about the separation between white people and black people during the time period. So as we go on through this time period of Jim Crow, then what we started seeing a lot of pushback. As we go into the civil rights movement, we saw people like Dr. King and the Southern Leadership Christian organization. We started seeing the Black Panther Party. We started seeing SNCC, Students in Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We started seeing all these organizations that were pushing back with the issues at the time. So at this time, what you did is you had people who were creating problems amongst the slaves. As we know that during the time of slavery, whenever there was a slave who created problems, they were punished. And generally they were punished in front of everybody else, whether it be typically a beating. But it was to teach everyone a problem everybody who created problems that you're going to have to pay for stirring up issues, right? The problem slaves, right? We call them today, we call them the field Negroes, right? Sometimes, or the rebellious Negroes, sometimes we use that term. And so in order to deal with those people at the time who were creating these issues, they instead of being, obvious about what they were doing, they created intelligence programs, specifically the covert intelligence program that was created by J. Edgar Hoover. And part of what happened with the COINTELPRO is the acronym that was used, was that although it talked about focusing on organizations that were or what they consider to be somewhat terrorist organizations or domestic terrorist organizations, it almost always focused specifically on black people and black organizations. And they infiltrated organizations like us, United Slaves. They infiltrated organizations, obviously the Black Panther Party, Dr. King, the Nation of Islam. All these organizations were infiltrated. And specifically it says that they were going to target any black person who was going to be seen as a black messiah, right? As a result of COINTELPRO, many of these organizations became dysfunctional. They used false intelligence. They used so many different things in order to, giving false reports to the media. They would go on, psychological warfare, smearing forged letters. They were doing all these things. Most of these individuals during that time, many of them left the country and went into exile. Many of them, people like Geronimo Pratt, ended up in prison. And people like Dr. King and Malcolm X ended up dead. And this was the result of this COINTELPRO movement. Of course, here we'll see Dr. King. We also see the Black Panther Party. And it's still back to the same 5 elements, the exploitation of human capital. In this movement and what was going on during this time period was that they were trying to eliminate anything that would disrupt their ability to exploit human capital, those being these organizations that were pushing back to the unjust system. And of course, it still goes back to the whole thing. We still talk about the money that is made on the prison labor, the human capital rules and regulations. We go from the new black codes and intelligence mandates of the COINTELPRO. And the same elements or the same people were used to enforce these rules and regulations during this time period. Now, we enter into the 1980s and what I call the intelligence agency's drug war on Black America. So basically, what is interesting about this time period is that the CIA's back country rebels were involved in. The CIA was trying to get money to help them fight, do whatever they needed to do in the Middle East. But however, Congress was not giving them the money that they needed. So in order for the CIA to generate revenue, to generate money, keeping in mind, it goes back to always the same theme in this country, it's money. So if the government wasn't going to give them the money directly, what they did is they got drugs from the Contra and basically filtered it into the black community. There was a book that was written, if you've never read it before, it's called Dark Alliance. It was written by a really good journalist by the name of Gary Webb from Northern California. And he basically breaks it down on how the CIA infiltrated put drugs into the black community in order to generate revenue. But also during this same time period, as we began to start going towards the late 80s and the Ronald Reagan's war on drugs, where you began to start getting harsher and stiffer laws against, certain drugs, specifically the sentencing for crack cocaine, which is primarily considered to be a black and brown drug, was far more severe than the sentence that you would get for powdered cocaine, right? So now what they're doing when we talk about the issue of the laws is that we're seeing that the sentencing and the discretion to enforce these laws were always directed towards black people. They were always directed towards African Americans. Then even as we begin to start going into the early 90s, we had much of the same situation where you had the crime bill, which again, it was about creating harsher sentences where you had individuals who they were putting into prisons and throwing away to keep putting them on the new plantation, right? Now, what would be the motive of why you would take a situation within the black community, keeping in mind that as you go into the crack cocaine era of the 1980s and even of the 1990s, you did not see the same type of devastation that you saw prior to that period. The 60s and 70s, although you did see issues with other drugs that people were using, you did have issues with heroin and other things that were going on, but it was just completely destroyed the black communities in the 80s and 90s. It accomplished a lot from the perspective that there was a lot of money generated, and it was also the time period in which private prisons were brought on the scene. So the prison population just really expanded at that time. And as a result, we saw black people going to jail in numbers that we had never seen before. Now, the 5 elements: exploitation of human capital, prison labor from the convictions of drug use and the drug trade, the production, again, the prison labor, the prison as a consumer. That's something that we never really understand. How do we make all this money? What is really into it? How can you make money in the prison system? What are you really talking about? The 80s and 90s until this time has created, not only was prior to this time, the prison system basically was the utilization of human capital. Now we still have that because you had private companies that actually use prison labor in some states to actually make products, right? Cheap labor. But what also happens is that now the prison itself has become a consumer. Number one is there's a thing called commissary. In other words, when you're in prison or you're in jail, people can give you buy things, right? You can buy cups of soup, you can buy candy bars, you can buy snacks, you can buy all these things, but you have to buy them from a particular vendor, right? Who's making a lot of money. The products that are sold to prisoners are sold at a higher rate than they are sold on the street. So these vendors are making a lot of money, by selling to these inmates, the commissary. You have other things like telecommunications. You have no idea how much money it costs to call somebody in jail. You just can't call. There's not like a payphone on the wall like you see on television. See, there's certain telecommunications companies that have actually contracts with the penal system or the penal institution. And so you have to put a certain amount of money on a account in order for them to even talk to you, right? I mean, they're making millions and billions of dollars off of telephone calls just to make a telephone call. There's no way that you can speak to your loved one in jail unless you have to make a deal with this specific telecommunications company. In order for you to send certain things in certain prisons, you have to purchase it from a particular company. In order to send books, in many cases, you have to go through Amazon, right? So the prisons, the things that they wear, their toothbrushes, where you're buying a Tylenol. Like you can go to the 99 cent and get a Tylenol. These companies are probably selling 2 Tylenols to the penal institution for probably $20. I mean, it's a cash cow. So everything that they're doing in these prisons, these private companies that they're using are making money, and many of the people who are investing in these companies are our legislators, some of the richest people in our country. They are, in some places, even prison guards are investing in these companies. I mean, it is absolutely, there's so much money that can be made, not to mention the bail system. You know, I mean, when you're taken into custody and you have to post bail. So, I mean, it's just an extremely profitable and one of the most profitable businesses in the country. There's way too much money, right? And then we talk about the rules and regulations. What's interesting and what people have to understand about the way that the criminal justice system works is that nothing really is as simple as it sounds. The reality of it is that white people and black people do dirt at the same rate. Nobody is really doing less dirt than the other person. It's a matter of how you're focusing your enforcement. It's a matter of how the district attorneys are use their prosecutorial discretion. So in many cases, when the prosecutor, if you're arrested, the case goes to the prosecutor. The prosecutor then makes a decision as to whether they're going to charge you or not. Now, there is no transparency in who they decide to charge. There's no statistics, there's no way of looking, but I can assure you, if you go into most courtrooms around this country, you'll find out that if you happen to be black or Latino, it's more likely that you're going to be charged than somebody else. And there's no question about that. And they have complete discretion in that process. The second issue is when you're talking about plea deals. I mean, we basically live in the plea deal system. It shouldn't be called the criminal justice system. It could easily be called the plea deal system. Because what happens is when individuals are charged with criminal acts, they are offered plea deals. In other words, they're typically offered a fraction of their exposure in order for the case to be resolved. So in other words, let's just say that you have a robbery and your exposure is 6 years. They may offer you 2 years, and you take the 2 years and let's say formal probation. That's the way it works. Now, what happens when they're doing the sentencing? There is no sentencing guideline. There is no transparency. And we have no idea how they make those decisions. But what we do know is that black people in plea deals get way more time than white people. Is that an accident? Right? There is no accident. That's part of the system. So when we talk about, although we're talking about the same laws on the books, there's a lot of discretion in that. And within that discretion, the discretion always seems to go against black people, right? It's almost like playing on a football team. And you know, when you play a sport, some games are at home and some games are away, right? And I used to have a coach that used to always say that when you play at home, just keep it close. But when you play on the road, you got to blow them out. You cannot leave it in the hands of the officials because the calls are not going to go your way. It's not your stadium. It's not your spectators. It's not your fans. It's not your locker room. It's not your field. So if it's a matter of a call, you're going to lose. So being black in America is like playing a whole schedule of away games because we don't have no home games. Every game that we have is an away game. So that means that we cannot leave any calls in the hands of the official because the calls are never going to go our way. That's what it's like. That's kind of the way it works. And I can just tell you that I'm not speaking from a conspiracy. I'm speaking from facts. All you have to do is look at the numbers. The numbers don't lie. There is no accident that black people are get longer sentences. It is no accident that black people are more likely to be prosecuted. These things are not accidental. More likely to get stopped. And if you're more likely to get stopped, you're probably more likely to get charged. And now in the age of where we see things on video camera, we see that when individuals are taken into custody, there's obviously much different treatment between people of color and white people, right? So if you're going into churches and you're killing people, and they're going to take you by and buy you Burger King on your way to jail, that's much different than what we've been seeing with all these other killings where these individuals aren't doing anything except running. In some cases, and in some cases, they are in complete control. They have handcuffs on them. We saw it in George Floyd. We see that it's not an accident that we're seeing these killings at these numbers, because it's part of not the system. Well, I can say system, but part of the business. So there's not really going to be much said about it, because in the final analysis, we care the most about the money. We talked a little bit about the private plantations, and I put the private plantations are back in business, private prisons, and big business. We talked about in the 80s where you had the private prisons. That's now what you've done is we took the plantation, and the government took over the plantation. Now they're giving a little bit of it back. But when you're in the private prisons are just like the plantation, because places like GEO or CCA, they make profits at the expense of black people. And like on the plantation, poor health services, excessive force, lack of appropriate care to private prisons are always under scrutiny, because it is pretty much a new plantation. Not to mention in these private prisons, the type of money that they're making. I mean, many of your legislators have these things. This is stock market. This is on the stock market. This is not the imprisonment of human beings is on the stock market, right? So if that's not, what are you paying? What are you investing in? You're investing in human capital, right? That's really what it is. Is that not plantation? Why would you put the imprisonment of a human being and invest in that? So what they do is, let's say, for example, the average cost of keeping a person in prison was $100 a day. Well, they just charge $200, right? And so in other words, so they're making all their money. The taxpayers are paying again, for human capital. And we see that basically GEO and CCA, they're the biggest ones. And they basically, not only do they have local, but as you can see, the federal government the Board of Prisons have facilities that are actually, and many of your senators, many of your congressmen are part of that. We go back, exploitation of human capital, private prisoners, the production plantation system. Then you got the human capital rules and regulations, sentencing laws, and prosecutorial discretion. The district attorney's office, in many cases, have completely taken over the job of plantation overseers. That's really the equivalent to it, the way in which they do these things, making sure that the those on the auction block are kept intact, and then once they go into the institution, then you have the prison guards that keep them intact, right? And then you have many officers who are actually out there. They're like slave patrols. Same thing. The same elements exist. We talk about the prison as a consumer of goods. We talked about for example, we talk about private firms who have specialized in the textile industries. They want to get contracts. So all these Fortune 500 companies and all these companies that are making big money are invested in these prisons. Plus, they are actually, lobbying to get contracts for many of these prisons. And that's what it is. We've consumerized the prison system. Numbers don't lie. We see the numbers of statistics, and this is based upon the numbers. So for every 2,306, you see African Americans on the numbers. You have American Indians 1,291, Natives 1,017. Latinos 831, white 450, and Asian 115. So there's over 3.3 million inmates incarcerated in the U.S. It's 698 people for 100. This is a rate of 2008. And so African Americans make up the largest majority of the prison population. And let's just look at the timelines. From 1900 to 1950, there was 50,000 inmates. From 1950 to 1970, you're talking about 75,000. 1970 to 1980, 110,000. 1980 to 1990, 175,000. 1990 to 2000, you're talking 500,000. As we go into the 2000s, we're talking about 2 million. I mean, we have such a large prison population that it's just unbelievable. Now, the question is, what do we do about it? How do we deal with it? The question is, how do we get off the auction block? What is it that we need to do? And we talked about in the book that I just did, When the Jury, Money, Vote, and Pride Comes Black. Jury. We have to lobby and mobilize because the jury is a very critical issue. What happens in most cases is that you have, the way the criminal justice system works is that if you choose to challenge your conviction, then you go into court and there's actually, in most cases, 12 people sitting in a jury box that are going to look at your case and make a decision as to whether you're guilty or innocent. The most important aspect of the American criminal justice system is the presumption of innocence. The reason why race makes every bit of a difference is for this reason. Most white Americans trust the police. Most white Americans do not have a negative experience with police. They trust the courts and do not believe that the police would arrest an innocent man, nor would the courts try to prosecute an innocent man. They don't believe those things would happen. Now, if you're to presume someone is innocent, you also have to presume two other things. You have to presume that the police arrested the wrong person. You would also have to presume that the courts are trying to prosecute the wrong person. If you don't presume those two things, then you cannot presume innocence. Those things do not exist in the same space. The jury system is the most important system. And I'm going to tell you that prosecutors, the way that the jury system works is that jury panels are chosen. They're brought into a courtroom and do a process called voir dire. Then 12 people are chosen. Generally, most jury panels are not predominantly African American. I have many times no African Americans. And oftentimes, even when there are African Americans, the prosecutor will go out of their way to make sure that there's not an African American on a jury, because they know they have a harder time with a case in front of an African American, because an African American is not going to allow them to an innocent person to go free, but they are going to hold the prosecution to their burden of proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt. As black people, what has to happen is there has to be a demand and a focus on the jury system. Why? Because when police officers are being tried for abuse, and the people on the jury panel who trust police officers are unlikely to convict that officer. However, if you're going to have people on the jury that look like the people that they are trying to prosecute, then that changes the game. There has to be mobilization. There has to be a concerted effort in order to get African Americans on the jury panel. In fact, the majority, there should be no less than 50% of African Americans on the jury if you happen to be African American, because how is that going to be a jury of your peers, especially in light of what we know? So there has to be a focus. Go to jury duty. There has to be jury reform. There has to be a lot of pressure put on these jury commissioners. That's extremely important. Next is collective economics, social entrepreneurship, right? America, and if the criminal justice system is about money, then we need to be able to buy justice like everybody else. So when I'm thinking about, I'm not talking about entrepreneurship, I'm talking about social entrepreneurship. I'm talking about a collective economics that is focused on solving problems. There's three things that black businesses need to focus on. Number one is educating the black consumer market, meaning educating the consumer about the importance of community wealth and recycling the dollar within the community and the importance of that. The second thing that has to be taken care of as far as social entrepreneurship or black social entrepreneurship is transformation. We have to transform our black consumer market into a more conscious consumer market when it comes to spending money. And number three is that we have to have businesses committed to two things. One is community wealth, and number two is community value. Building community wealth, building community value. Those are the two things. We have to do that. Collective voting. What do we need to do? Number one, like we're starting to see it, but we definitely need, if you are a convicted felon, you should still be able to vote, right? So what they're doing is, people didn't know that, is when they used to, back in the day, when they were trying to make a determination as to representatives within legislature, they would count a black person who couldn't vote as 3/5 of a human being. If you think about the prison system, it's the same thing. You're counted as a person in that district for numbers, but you can't vote. So it's the same thing. There's no reason why someone who is a convicted felon can't vote. Because if we do start voting, first of all, we need to start voting, and we need to start voting collectively. But what also we need to do as a collective is start getting something for our vote. We can't always be committed to one party. And we, obviously, this is actually I think that Joe Biden was confirmed as to be the president today. So obviously we really needed to get what we had in office out of office. But from this point on, we need to make sure that we focus on demanding things from our representatives. We can't give things away. And then we have to understand the last thing, pride and value, right? Pride and value is extremely important, because one of the things that has happened to many African Americans, I think, is that we shortchange ourselves as to the richness, the value, and our greatness. When you talk about the African American, you're talking about individuals who went through the slave, the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, who went through centuries of slavery, who went through black codes, Jim Crow, who went through the civil rights issues, who went through COINTELPRO, all of this, but yet and still, we're still strong. And the reason why that we're often targeted in many ways is because I think they fear our greatness. People don't do those things that they fear. Nobody goes after the challenger. Everybody goes after the champ, right? You're not worried about the person. You don't go out of your way to try to stop somebody that you know that can't succeed. You go out of your way to stop people that you're fearful of. So we have to understand that greatness of us, but we also have to understand our value. That as black people, we have to make sure that we focus on the family and make sure that we focus on, the valuable things and value our culture and being positive, right? And stop hating on each other and stop doing the Willie Lynch thing where we hate on each other. That's important. So if we're able to do those things, we can get off the auction block. So at any rate, I want to thank everybody for this lecture. I appreciate it, and may God bless you.
Yeah, I gotta tell you, I gotta let you know, straight up, this is Zulu's testimony, a faith and a message to my haters. Straight up, let's go, no holding back. Might try to knock him, but you'll never stop him, cause it was destiny. Mentally on a level that they would never see. Shelbyville, Tennessee, from humble beginnings. A single mother raising her son was hard living. She was working 2 jobs.